think this is a system, it's a symbiotic evolution that's required, not just blaming government for it. I think this is going to be a new theory of value. Look, necessity is really powerful. Necessity is the mother of invention. Necessity is on the table. And I think there's vast amounts of value that's going to be constructed, or vast amounts of risks and liabilities that can be constructed if we don't do it. And that's the urgency that we have to operationalize.
Hello everyone, and welcome to FutureX, a podcast by Martin Hearn, Event Director at Futurebuild, and co-host Dr Olli Jones, Research Director at Ryder Architecture. FutureX will bring together some of the brightest minds and some of the most disruptive thinkers and innovators to transform the construction industry and build a FutureX community of like-minded people that can begin to make a real change. We really hope you enjoy the series.
Hello and welcome to FutureX. My name is Martin Hearn and I'm Event Director at Futurebuild, and I am once again joined by Dr Olli Jones at Ryder Architecture. Oliver, this week we have got a stellar guest. And I know I always say that, but truly this person absolutely blew my mind.
Mate, Indy has blown my mind numerous times. I think I first came across Indy probably about 2 years ago. Could not stop thinking about the things that Indy talked about at the time. And for me, I've followed everything that's come from Indy and Dark Matter Labs ever since. I think these guys are on the cutting edge of how we need to really start to restructure things in order to meet the 2050 goals and just create a better society, to be quite honest with you. The stuff that's coming out of their labs is insanely exciting. It's really next level in terms of the way they're thinking about things. And I was absolutely over the moon to get Indy on the podcast because he's such a nice bloke. He has such a breadth of knowledge. And again, I didn't sleep for about 24 hours after speaking to him because the ideas that are flowing out of this guy and that are coming out of Dark Matter Labs are incredibly exciting.
Absolutely. You know, you can sum him up really by calling him a true visionary because he's just thinking on a different plane to anyone I've ever spoke to. And for those people that don't know who Indy Johar is, he's an architect. He was co-founder of Project 00. He is the founder of Dark Matters. He worked with the Wiki House. He's been part of Blocks Hub. He's on various REBA trustee and boards. He's an extremely busy man, extremely connected, and yeah, just coming out with some ideas and work that will just literally blow your mind.
Well, I was going to try and summarize the things that we talked to Indy about, but in actual fact, it's probably almost impossible to do in the time that we've got. So if you want to know what it's about, you're just going to have to give it a listen, but you won't be disappointed. So let's give it a listen. Hey, Indy, thanks for joining us, mate.
Absolute pleasure, always.
I'll tell you what, it's going to be exciting having you as a guest on the panel at the 100-year plan at Futurebuild, but we've got a lot to discuss before that. So maybe let's loop back around to that. For the listeners, it would be wonderful if we could just give them a bit of a flavor of who you are, where you came from, what you're about.
So, name's Indy Johar. I trained as an architect, but in the course of doing architecture early on, I started to realize the future was not going to be built through consulting. As an architecture, it's a consulting framework. It had to be built by actually prototyping, making things. So really, with people like Melissa Me, got involved in building stuff like the Bristol Urban Beach, to with people like Jonathan Robertson, building the Impact Hub network, to writing the book Compendium for the Civic Economy, to building open source furniture, Open Desk, to Wiki House, open source housing. And really what we were focused on was how do you radically democratize the city? Not democratize in terms of vote, but how do you make the city in a radically democratic way, both in terms of form, function, and the process? And that's really what we've been doing. But about 2015 onwards, started to realize that underneath the democracy of making, there were fundamental questions about how we organize, which were, as architects, designers, if you gave architects the problem of solving the housing crisis, what they tend to do is build ever smaller homes and say, look, we can make it cheaper or make it smaller. And actually what you start to realize, the fundamental problem of housing perhaps isn't the design of the house, but it's the idea of land value and the idea of who captures land value and who pays for infrastructure and how does infrastructure, social infrastructure priced into systems. And you start to realize there's a whole problem systemically in property rights and how they're structured and who extracts value. And I think those are the questions that really started to intrigue us. So that's where Dark Matter Labs was born. We're now 7 years old. There's about 60 of us. We're not for profit. The team is full of lawyers, accountants, coders, designers. Yeah, so we're a polymathic team, geographers, and we're really looking at those questions of the dark matter underneath our built environment and how do you reimagine it in radical ways.
Just take us through some of the things that you've been working on recently. Give us a bit of a flavor.
So a lot of the work that working on is what we call civic goods. How does a house is conceived as a private good, but actually, if you look at a house in terms of the garden and its ecological relationship, or the watershed of the house, or effectively the materials of the house and the impacts it has, or effectively the social impacts of bad housing, you start to realize a house is not just a private good; it's a relational good. It's a thing that exists in an entire. So a lot of the work that we're doing is actually looking at this idea of the entangled economy. We did some work around the High Line in New York, which cost 174 million to build, but generated 3.04 billion of uplift value in land. So what we started to figure out was that actually what we've been seeing is the greatest enclosure of public and civic wealth into private hands in the last 50 years. It's a mass privatization of public goods indirectly. And what we've been looking at is effectively how do you rebuild this new civic economy, whether it's through the lens of a house or even reimagining a camera, a surveillance camera in a radically new way, all the way through to tree canopy of a city or the whole city retrofit of a city, all the way through to a river system. And how do you reimagine super scale ecological systems of civic goods, which have multiple forms? And we're looking at different ways of going from single point ownership models to multi-stakeholder relationship models to self-sovereign and to digitally self-sovereign systems. And how do you build into that worldview? So a lot of our work is around demonstration of these things, looking at the system innovations, and then looking at how do you create the demand of the organizational infrastructures like a carbon treasury to be able to actually, for cities to make the right decisions around these things. So what we're looking at the supply demand side of that stuff, and making that happen.
And in terms of the challenges that you see ahead, I know you've spoken quite passionately about the challenges that we're facing. Can you give us a tour through those challenges?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, just in relationship to this conversation, is that let's start here. If we were to take national carbon budgets seriously, which we have to because they are actually a legally binding instrument, there is no new build housing in the UK. There is no future build. Be provocative. There is no build in the future.
Tell Martin.
And no, but I think this is really important because I think we've created a mythos of there being 300,000 homes a year being built. The reality is we can probably afford next to zero. Maybe if it's extraordinary housing, you get to 10,000, but you don't get significantly anywhere close. And people like Chris Brown, who built Igloo, have acknowledged that and stepped out of development because of that reality. So like when you do the numbers, you start to realize we're operating into a completely different future. So we do not have the material economy over the next 20 years, I would say. It's not forever, but there is a period we don't. And that's because we don't have the energy infrastructure to mine the materials to do the work, and we don't have the demographics in terms of labor forces to do that work. We were part of looking at large scale retrofit, which we have been, but we don't actually have the material economy, the hydrocarbons to mine the materials to do the labor work, to do the retrofit in the way that people are talking about. So there are fundamentals that are challenging to all the kind of rhetoric of how we build spatial justice by building new homes. Now that opens up a really radical question. Is what is spatial justice when you don't have basically 300,000 homes coming to the market every year? How do you build an equitable future when you don't have that additionality? And that I think is the innovation space that's really going to become really critical. And this is to also recognize over the last, 30 years, so whatever, 40 years, we've had the greatest investment in our material economy in probably the UK for a long time. If you look at development rates, commercial development rates, all of that stuff, large scale renewal, we've had significant material pouring into rebuilding of the UK in many formats. That was perhaps the wisest thing we could have done because that was the cheapest hydrocarbon, cheapest material economy we're going to have for the next 40 years. So the question of the next 40 years is radically different. Now, why I say 40 is it's not an infinite reality. So if we don't all kill ourselves as a human species, which is quite likely as we go into scarcity, the threat of war with geopolitical fragmentation, bullshit theories of autonomy, will create the spaces of conflict. Now, if we could bypass that space of conflict, we do have technologies which are for small modular reactors will come forward quickly, but mass global adoption will take time, and the security infrastructure to build that will take time. You do have actually fusion perhaps coming to the bear in that way. So we do get energy sources, storage sources do become more available, energy storage mechanisms do become surgical mining does become possible, biomass recorrection in terms of, all moving to veganism. So we reduce land for food uses and we increase actually biomass capacity for timber and other production becomes rebalanced over that period. So there is a systemic energy, material, biolandscape transformation we're in the middle of. And I think the fundamentals are just being largely ignored. And in a way, we're just rhetorically just moving forward. And it's not that future. And it's coming to an end very quickly. And in a way, inflation is not monetary inflation. Inflation is actually a resource limitation driven inflation. There are planetary limits that are starting to come into effect. Now, those are not finite or infinite in terms of control, but there is a period to which we will go through that. And I think that's worth us recognizing.
And I guess this falls into the discussion that we've been having around this one, the idea of the 100-year plan. And the reason why I say 100 years is because it's more of a vision in terms of what's out there. What are we aiming for? And it has to be beyond our own lifetime. But that rhetoric that you mentioned is so familiar in terms of we seem to be going through phases of defining a problem or a challenge, redefining the problem or the challenge, slightly shifting from a government perspective, saying, let's wait for industry to provide a solution, while industry waits for government to provide a roadmap. And then when we get close to making some moves in that direction, and albeit the wrong direction, as you've outlined there, we then start to define and redefine something closely related to the topic that we were talking about 2 years ago. So we jump from net zero, we jump to retrofit, we jump to circularity, but there's very little progress made in any of those spaces. And for me, what seems to be happening at the moment is a lot of unhelpful rhetoric builds because we fall back on past behaviors and we start to commercialize the problem. We make the problem one that only experts can solve, only expert consultancy teams can engage with and grapple with. And then we revel in that problem because there's commercial worth to doing it.
Look, I would totally agree. And I think there's two aspects of that, which I would just double down on, is that there is a lockstep problem here, which is the capabilities that the industry has to offer are not necessarily the capabilities and the capacities that are required in the 21st century economy. So there's an existential crisis for industry, which is whilst real estate developers are important, they're relevant to the future. And so real estate management in its traditional sense, who gives a shit? Because actually, fundamentally, it's been about land value appreciation. Very little of it has really been about human outcome driving. Those real estates are going to become deeply kind of slums of the 21st century. Indoor air pollution, light pollution generation, noise pollution generation. I just walked past Hackney Central, right? And there are these blocks of housing built right next to the station. Now, that's all fine. And they've got really brilliantly double glazed or triple glazed windows. But actually, in summer, how the fuck do you cool the place down? And so they have to open the windows. Like, if you open the windows, it means from about 5 o'clock in the morning till about 12 o'clock at night, there are trains running, which means you've fundamentally destroyed the sleep capacity of children and adults, and you've undermined it. And we know somebody who sleeps next to a busy road, actually you take 2 to 3 years worth of your life. So the strategic fucking decisions here are problematic. And I think there's just bullshit going on because that was just all about land value. That did not systemically look at the issues on the table. And it was just about unlocking land value in one very particular way. So I think these things are coming to roost. And I think there's a capability problem of industry. And there's a kind of what I'd call an illusion problem of government has to almost create the illusion right now of everything will be fine. And actually what we have to start to recognize is there's a systemic unwind on the table of the order of the Marshall Plan, right? 68% of businesses, if you price in social environmental costs, don't work. So I think this is quite structural.
So how do we start to make moves to recalibrate? But there's clearly a reckoning and acceptance that certain modes of business, certain types of business don't work. There's clearly an acceptance that we are not going to have the skills and the training in place necessary to address this to the deadlines that we've put in place. So what are the next steps, Indy?
I think for me, the first thing is having an honest debate, right? I think pulling ourselves out of the rhetorical compromises that we're constantly locked in. The honesty of the debate, and I don't mind if someone can say, hey guys, we've done the numbers, you can get 20,000 home. Okay, great. We did the numbers, we get to about 19,000 on top, right? But let's have an honest debate.
Yeah.
Because that allows for actually a recalibrate. Then we have to start to systemically price these issues in. The reason why our economy favors a can of Coke versus a sustainable apple is because a can of Coke externalizes all those costs. Healthcare costs, addiction costs in terms of actually associated carbon costs, water pollution, all those stuff is outsourced. Whereas a sustainable apple have to insource all those costs. So a sustainable apple is deeply more expensive than a can of Coke. That is a systemic pricing problem because one is externalizing those liabilities. It means the pool of capital always flows to the can of Coke as opposed to the apple because of what it can do. Now, unless we start to change our pricing infrastructure at societal level, the can of Coke is all we can fund, and thereby it becomes a self-terminating mechanism. I use it as an analogy to see what our systemic questions are. So honest conversation, new discourse on pricing, recognizing those things. I think a massive investment in human development. I think this is one of those moments where we're going to have to significantly invest in human development. I think the Tony Blair era of investment was actually just even a blip on the scene of what's required in terms of the transformation of our universities, transformation of our human development cycles. Then I think we have to invest massively in systemic innovation, like we did in the Marshall Plan, or certainly places like Italy did significantly. We have to rebuild our industries in radical new format. And I think that's the level of conversation we need to be having. And that's the level of conversation a new government will need to be having in the next 18 months or so. Otherwise, I think we're just living in a kind of rhetorical bullshit that we've been living for the last 5-10 years. It's not useful. It's not intelligent. It's not smart. And reality is more interesting than any mythos that we can construct. And if we engage with it, it's a real strategic advantage.
Indy, I think one of your challenges is how do we even have that honest debate? Because people are so focused on the now that sometimes this long-term thinking just gets ignored, or it will come to that when we get to it. How do we start that now and start to address these issues in a way that people can understand?
I personally think these issues are no longer long-term. So if you look at food prices, if you look at timber prices, if you look at energy prices, if you look at these are no longer long-term. This is not. If you're being a responsible business owner and you are not factoring these issues, I'm sorry, shareholders should really be examining you as an operator in business. Because this is a fiduciary responsibility. These trends are knowable, visible, and understandable. And if you haven't factored them in, I think there's a real question to be asked about your leadership. If a developer, the strategic developer, isn't looking at the national carbon budgets and saying, what is our plan with regards to this? And hasn't got an inherent carbon treasury function running, just some of the things that we're starting to build, I think they've got real problems. So for me, this is no longer a future scenario work. This stuff is on our balance sheet. It's coming at us. The risks are already material. They're no longer hypothetical risks.
Challenge appears that we're just not appreciating the scale and complexity of the problem in its broadest sense, in that there's a series of unintended consequences that are occurring, at least from the way I can see the problem, from all parties' actions, is resulting in a massive tangle of other unintended consequences because we weren't appreciating the holistic complexity of the challenge that really is on our doorstep, as you say. And a good example of this to me recently is I work with a lot of large insurance funds who have huge swathes of estate up and down the country, but they are jettisoning big parts of their portfolio based on how readily they could be retrofit to meet a net zero future. Right, look, the focus is on the wrong thing here. It is, as a very small problem, you're not viewing that Victorian factory, which has got 2 million bricks in it, as a material bank, as something that has inherently far more in the material that's embodied in it than saying, oh, it's just too difficult to insulate and put triple glazing in.
And that's because our balance sheets are problematic. So if developers, and this is again a conversation we're in the middle of, if developers turned around and had a material balance sheet and understood the material balance sheet as a key part of their asset base, they would start to have different value conversations. And that's really not a difficult thing. It's about recognizing in future terms what's happening to our material economy and starting to reportion it. Currently, in a way, the use class of a building is more significant in terms of its valuation than its material economy. That's largely been the function, right? So the use value of a building is where most of the value is, and the material economy will shift. over
Yeah.
this period. And that's a real issue, real strategic reevaluation.
Arguably, we've been in this space within residential design for quite a long time because we've gone through annual cycles for the last decade of brick shortages. Any house builder, any mass house builder knows all about these problems and challenges in the supply chain. Every one of them knows that there's thousands and thousands of bricks to be had if we just reduce it to the brick conversation in our existing buildings and our existing material banks. But cultures and behaviors of saying, oh, they're just too difficult to clean up. What really gets me in that mentality is that actually there's absolutely no appreciation currently, I think it's slightly changing, for the social and natural and environmental costs of mining those raw materials and creating new bricks. That's, there'll always be new bricks. There probably won't be.
Yeah, I agree with you. I suppose I want to take it out of the cultural discourse of appreciating that value to turning it into a balance sheet function, right? I don't want to have, why don't you be nice to developer conversations? Why don't you become a little bit nicer? Because that doesn't work. That's not a systemic change. I think what we have to do is change the theory of balance sheets of buildings. We have to re-examine how these, I think unless we bury it into our accounting frameworks of value, this stuff just becomes rhetorical. So I think there is systemic transformation required. I think every developer should be running a carbon treasury across their net assets as a key part of that management function, asset management function in an integrated way. So should every pension fund. Now, so these are sort of things that we're currently exploring something with one city to explore building that integrated carbon treasury model, but because you need these instruments. So without these structural decision-making instruments, I don't think we can make the right decisions. And that's, I think, a key part of the story. Hi, Martin. Sorry.
Indy, what role does regulations have to play here? Because we saw this with the zero carbon homes, that house builders would build up to a code until the very last minute until they have to switch. Oliver, we spoke to Johan and Tepio, and he was talking about the developers still putting in gas boilers right until that deadline of when they have to switch. What roles do regulations have to play, and how do we move this forward?
I think regulations have a role to play. I think the current problem that we've got is any form of higher regulation is going to massively systemically increase costs of production to the point that's not viable. And what that means is that systemically drives, I would say, a corruptive behavior. So regulation ups the cost and people try to get past the regulation in any form of, I'm using the word corruptive in its broadest sense, I get out the spirit of the legislation that's required. Now, that I think is a systemic problem that as a society, as a whole society, we have a systemic structural issue that we are no longer in net terms creating surplus energy in a civilizational terms. We have an energy deficit emerging. And that means corruptive behaviors become the natural source of organizing, but you can't cover the inherent cost in the system. So yes, regulation has a role to play, but I don't think it's a traditional ratcheting up model that's going to be sufficient. I think we have to think systemically about a new theory of value to which regulation can then structure in new ways and new ways of building that responsibility in new format. So I think it's not the traditional ratcheting up. It won't work. It'll just drive more corruptive behaviors, and we don't have the enforcement mechanisms to drive that. I think this requires a new theory of value and then a new theory of regulation with that. And that has to be done in an integrated way. So yes. So
I just want to change the shift of the conversation slightly, but it's totally related. In terms of, do you think that if we start to talk about the circular economy or moving towards circularity
Sure.
and more resilience, local resilience, do you think there is a need to move away from, and do you think that the problem lies with centralization? Do we need to move away towards a decentralized, more local material production, more local vernacular in terms of materials? So Yorkshire, North Yorkshire have quite an exciting plan in terms of the bioeconomy that's starting to take shape in terms of how can they best use their agricultural space? How can they best use their coastline and the acres and acres of new seaweed farming that's being developed? And is there a macroalgae microeconomy that can be spun out into something that can really start to service the resilience of that region? So it's just your thoughts on that centralized, decentralized move towards already.
So the biomaterial or the kind of bioregional view is going to be fundamental, both in terms of actually, yes, the material economy, but also in terms of actually food systems. I think the food economy that we build, and also in terms of water, flooding risk, strategic flooding risk, and in terms of actual local energy production. But that will sit in a global planetary information economy, right? And that will sit in actually almost certainly a rare planetary economy. So I think one of the things I find we just need to be really nuanced about this. Yes, we're going to have to massively create new forms of decentralized capabilities at certain levels. We're also going to have to create new forms of planetary access and supply chain simultaneously. So I think it's a simultaneous, and at a developmental level, you and I could be sitting across the planet right now and having this conversation. So at another level, we will still be planetary organisms. At a carbon level, Yorkshire solves its carbon problem. If Nigeria doesn't, we're all dead.
Yeah.
So we also start to have to understand that there's a planetary relationship. So my slight nuance here is that we're more and more talking about, say, what is a planetary Yorkshire? So Yorkshire looks at itself, but in relationship to its metabolic relationships at a planetary scale. So it doesn't become a red line boundary problem, because it isn't a red line boundary problem. It never will be. Yorkshire is massively ingrained into a planetary development, to planetary metabolic flows. So governance no longer can be red line boundary. It has to look at your metabolic flows and actually govern those relationships and co-develop those relationships in really healthy ways. So I think you're absolutely right. Massive shift in the bioregional landscape. I think we have to have nuanced language around this in a new way. Otherwise, there's a risk. This is the risk I'm trying to hold back, is there's a kind of myth of localism. A myth that we can solve this by putting a little boundary around a little town and we're going to just be fine. And I guarantee you, we won't be fine, because nothing, the screen that we're on, the clothes that we're wearing, the glasses that we wear, the watches that we carry, none of that can be produced in Yorkshire.
Yeah.
And I think unless we understand this local global relationship in a new way, in a sort of planetary relationship, there's a myth of localism that I think will lead us to, in extreme senses, a myth of autonomy. We can be autonomous, which is not real, and thereby the myth of war as a net zero sum game. I think there's a strategic risk here that we as advocates of ideas need to create the right frames that host this language properly and not get sucked into a myth of localism as a solution.
So one of the things to follow on from that, and going back to the materials and the availability of materials over the next 40 years, it would appear that although some plans seem sensible on the surface, that they could be seen as quite punitive. For instance, the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. You start to look at that and the way that it is intentionally going to be rolled out across Europe for more and more products. And on the surface of it, it seems illogical. It seems a sensible approach to take. Let's support what's going on within Europe. Let's build our capabilities, our capacity, and make sure that the material that we are buying is green. But the counter to that is that it's exclusive as well, and it's not a planetary approach. It's not going to make a difference, as you've said, if China or Nigeria are not part of the solution.
I would agree. And my intuition would be, so from a UK perspective for a moment, I think I would like the UK to open up its borders for anyone that actually fully complies to UK regulations. So labor and materials and regulatory frameworks. So I would say that we should digitize our regulatory frameworks, open up our relationship, and thereby build that demand and supply capacity. But they have to provide the labor as well. So it's not just material economy, it's not just material goods. And that allows for a fair level field of innovation. And I think we're going to have to talk about these entanglements of material formats to be able to drive them. But I agree with you. I think the kind of autonomous plan, I can see why it's been done. It's about economic advantage, and I understand that in terms of sequencing. But I think there are systemic issues that I think we have to recognize that unless we all make this transition, this is why this is a class transformation problem. If Europe makes the transformation, but actually the big economies in the global south don't, remember by 2070, most of the tropics become uninhabitable at the current rate. Uninhabitable. That's billions of people on the move or not surviving. So actually, we have to make, and any risk of that isn't just about those billions of people. It's almost certainly a risk of global war and bioterrorism and other things. So don't worry about don't think they're isolated, because if that goes that badly wrong, there'll be contagion effects on a planetary scale. So we have to find a mutually interdependent evolutionary solution. And that has got to be the strategic aim of any, I think, advanced government, has to recognize that interdependence. And that's what I would be deeply advocating for a new UK government to really start to talk about this and materially lead this position. And I think it requires leadership to build that position and to be able to actually operationalize in a new way.
What forum does this take, though, Andy? Going back to Martin's question before, COP should have been the forum, but it's not. But
it should be the forum, but I think a new government in the UK is a really interesting forum. I think a new government in the UK can actually start to deal with the reality. The UK, as a result of Brexit, has accelerated its position of creative destruction. It's going to have to destroy its existing economy as a function of Brexit. But actually, most of that economy was going to get destroyed 5, 10 years later anyway. Bemoaning the loss of the car, maybe that's a loss. Maybe this is exactly the time unwind that we need. And what we should be talking about is electric bike history and being the centerpiece of the world's electric bike industry and production. So I think we're in a period of creative destruction. I think the UK, if it's positioned well, becomes a very interesting landscape for driving its transition. And I think the timing is almost perfectly right.
You've talked in the past, and I've very much enjoyed your presentations on this web of value complexity that we don't really appreciate when we're talking about value. And particularly enjoyed your ideas around how value interlinks and how that we should embrace the chaos of that value. And I would just wonder whether or not you could tell us a little bit more about how you see value and the broader sense of value within the built environment. There are all these pockets around. We've got social pockets, environmental pockets, biodiversity pockets. What's your take on that web of value?
Right. So I think a lot of the work that we're doing and what we're seeing is that, let's talk from the city's perspective. So everyone has been glorifying cities for the last 30 years as the future of transition. I think, unfortunately, because of the global fiscal infrastructure, we're seeing a massive centralization of transformational capability because effectively monetary printing capacity is almost central to transition. So cities have become fragile instruments in that reality because actually the fiscal capacity is centralized and the monetary capacities, innovation capacities are centralized. So that means all this heralding of mayors are going to drive the future. Most mayors are now fragile. You look at the London GLA situation, actually in a transition where they're carrying the vast liabilities of the whole economy and the risks are starting to cascade. Poverty, energy, poverty, health, educational risks, infrastructure costs, all starting to cascade in cities. So cities are now becoming what I would call the cascading point of failure. Now, that's the dark side of the story. And given what percentage of the population sits and lives in cities, that is what is starting to happen. The other side of that is cities are also the point of what I would call intersectional investment. So if you invest in a tree canopy of a city, you can actually create jobs, yes, but you can also you can deal with heat island stress problems, you can deal with flooding risk problems, you can deal with health outcomes, you can deal with community cohesion if you build a network of urban forests. So that piece of infrastructure investment, let's call it infrastructure, creates, or quasi-infrastructure, creates multi-beneficiary systems. It improves house values if that's where you want to go. So it improves air quality systemically. So all of these things. So the big question for us is physical investments, or these sort of investment models actually create multi-beneficiary systems. And actually what we've got to be able to do is price and value those intersections. So we've also got to create capacity for intersectional investment, which means actually building the policy architecture for multiple parts, government and insurance companies to be able to collaborate in that value formation. So for me, that's just one example. You could talk about, I don't know, the intelligence of a city. So we're doing work around what is the collective intelligence of a city. Intelligence is not, as we've been locked into a very individualistic agenda of my intelligence versus your intelligence or master's intelligence. But actually, intelligence is a dialogic process. It's actually about intelligence between people. So if we start to think of an asset of the city being intelligence, right, the intelligence of the city, that as a fundamental asset, how do you invest into develop that asset? Right? That requires a completely different theory of investment. That starts to reimagine what is a public balance sheet. Public balance sheet is now material economy of a city, material treasury of a city. It's the embodied carbon of a city. It's the nature-based infrastructure of a city. All these things start to become critical new balance sheets of the city as a whole. And I think those sorts of things are all intersectional value propositions. I think they're going to be absolutely critical to deal with the cascading risks that cities are going to face. And it requires a new theory of coordination and a new theory of practice between different departments in government, both at the city scale, but also through the stacks of whether.
Indy, I wonder if we have the intelligence and the skill set within our current governments, and whether we need to radically rethink about, how that is staffed, and because there's a huge amount of thinking and skill set needed to make these radical changes.
Yeah, I would say respectfully, the last 10 years of government and 12 years of government have been the degradation of capability. UK had probably one of the most advanced capability governments, and we've seen the systemic degradation of that capability. And I think we're going to have to see a sort of, I'm sorry to keep referencing Tony Blair. I do apologize to all the audience, but we're going to have to see that scale of rebuild of our capabilities in a systemic sense. And I think that is going to be necessary. And that capability is not just a government problem, it's an industry problem. I also want to make that super clear. I think this is a system, it's a symbiotic evolution that's required, not just blaming government for it. I think this is going to be a new theory of value. Look, necessity is really powerful. Necessity is the mother of invention. Necessity is on the table. And I think there's vast amounts of value that's going to be constructed, or vast amounts of risks and liabilities that are going to be constructed if we don't do it. And that's the urgency that we have to operationalize. But Martin, totally agree.
Yeah. What role has this developments in AI blockchain had in you as an organization? Is that something you must have to embrace for this large scale thinking and research and analysis?
Yeah, totally. So for example, we're using agent-based models to look at, the growth aspect of a tree canopy and its impact models as a result of that, some machine learning capabilities to be able to look at that. Yes, no doubt. I also think there's a paradigm leap inherent in technology that when you start to look at stuff, so the kind of technology for me is it's systemically transforming our theory of bureaucracy. And I use bureaucracy at a philosophical level, which is our theory of organizing society in different formats. So whether it's our theory of, like, for example, technology is allowing us to unbundle property rights, reimagine structure of property, and unbundling and digitalizing those property rights. It's allowing us to build new forms of accountability for those property rights. It's allowing us to take our land registries and take them from being a registry of property to being a pixel ID of property, where every land is a pixel to which actually has different forms of stakeholder relations. So we're seeing technology opening up the ground landscape for these different worldviews. I think we're talking about self-sovereign. So we can do stuff like self-sovereign buildings in new ways that have never been done before, because technology is opening up some of those landscapes. So technology is a key component. I also think that there's choices with technology. So are we using technology as a theory of control, as an extension of our control economy, or are we using technology as a theory of ennoblement? And actually, what are we using it for? And there's a risk that we're currently extending technology as a theory of control landscape, and we're not doing the human development investment to unlock actually what is a new form of organizing. So for example, the future of a corporation is not a chief executive officer in terms of control-oriented leadership. It's not the C-suite of control. It's actually learning. Learning will be the CEO. The chief learning officer will be the CEO. Because in a complex emergent world, it is the learning that drives the quality assurance. It's the learning that drives the risk mitigation. It's the learning that drives actually dealing with complexity in new ways. So I think both the combination of technologies opening up new human capabilities. I think how we use that technology is fundamental. We're going to have to reimagine our theory of registries, all of that structure, identity, rights, all these frameworks are going to be radically revolutionized. And even I would argue a lot of the work that we're doing, even in terms of how we're using money and monetary production, can be radically reimagined. You've got central bank digital coins being talked about. I think we're not innovating hard enough on that stuff. It's still a very centralized world view. What does that look like in 21st century investment models? I think there's landscapes opening up, but I think we have to be deeply engaged in those in different ways, rather than just like the Bank of England or the ECB do that without actually deep engagement in what that means for future democracy.
And Indy, I'm going to roll back a tiny bit because we haven't discussed with our listeners what your ideas around the self-sovereign building are. So you've mentioned it a few times. Can you give us a bit of a breakdown on that, please?
Sure. So we're working on something called the Free House. You've seen around the world, there's been all sorts of work done where effectively a river is given the legal sovereignty on itself, forests, whether it's in New Zealand or in Canada. And what we've been exploring is, what does it look like for actually a building to adopt that similar form? So we move away from theories of ownership of buildings to recognize that a piece of land has multiple stakeholders, whether it's actually the ecological system or the water rights that flow through it, or the material economy that actually has a 100-year cycle, to the energy rights of that building, to the bees that go there, all the way through to the insects in the microbiome of that environment. Also the healthcare and social costs that it generates. So when you look at it through a multi-stakeholder perspective, you start to realize our theory of single point ownership doesn't work. So that means that you have to start to reinvent how we govern and steward buildings from this multi-stakeholder perspective. And that takes the point of view from ownership, which is dominion and control through a single party's needs, to a multi-stakeholder response, which is actually recognize all these things have to flourish in symbiosis, and human flourishment is dependent on the simultaneous flourishing of all these other systems. So a lot of the work is actually then about how do you construct the legal institutions and the financial mechanisms and the theories of stewardship. So if you don't own something, how do you steward something? What are the use rights of a building? How is the material economy owned? What does land ownership, going beyond land ownership in that method mean? So we're unbundling these different things, building different economies around the material, around the use and the theory of land, and how they intersect in new forms of value. And that also means that actually, what's the UX of a contract where you are there to steward something and preserve and enhance all these multi-stakeholder? What's your responsibility mechanism in that? How do you build that in new ways? So I think that also starts to change the material economy of where we live and what that building looks like. And that to me is fundamentally interesting as well, and how we experience and interface with that building in a really radically different way, rather than as a consumer and rather than a consumer theory of relationship.
We've covered an unbelievable amount of ground in the space of 30 minutes. How on earth, Indy, do you relax at the end of a day? There's a question for you. How do you switch off? Do you switch off? Do you ever switch off?
Oh, no, I do switch off, or I try to at least. It's pretty, I have to admit, it's pretty full on right now. And it has been for a few years. Like, building DM, we've been trying to do this through a learning modality. We've been changing pretty much how we govern, operationalize ourselves, all the way internally through pay structures, everything. Because I don't think this is possible. You can't build this future without transforming how you operate as an organism. And so it's pretty full on, I have to admit. And I also wanted to do this. I kind of wanted to prove that this was possible in really radical ways. And it's not just a bunch of architects sitting in a room. Actually, how do you build the polymathic capabilities to really build this stuff? I'm not going to lie, it's full on. I'm in the middle of it, but it's super interesting.
And how to tell us a bit about the changes that you've made, Dark Matter Labs.
Sorry, I wouldn't take credit for this. There's people like Annette Damani and various other people have been massively involved in this, and obviously massively inspired by people like Indy Johar at Civic Square and what they've been doing. So we're part of a movement of people and organizations that are doing some of this stuff, all the way from pay for us is radically not about compensation to your market value. Pay is about how do you create almost a platform to allow you to do the work that you want to do. I'm not the best paid person in DM, right? So even though historically I talked about as one of the founders. So we transform theories of pay, theories of responsibility, and like put learning at the center of the organization as a theory as opposed to traditional control mechanisms. So we've done how we make decisions as an organism. It's not consensus based. Typically you have a centralized decision model or a consensus decision model. They're both shit in my view for different reasons. Consensus actually creates an average decision, which is non-contextual, and the centralized makes an abstractive decision, which is non-usual. So how do you create new forms of radical autonomy with new forms of peer-to-peer accountability in the model, which becomes really critical, which allows us to deal with complexity. So we've been building some of that stuff. So that's just the internal stuff, and as well as all the work that we're really doing on the front-facing side. Like I'm saying, the carbon treasury, new forms of public balance sheets, new forms of funding arrangements to be able to fund new forms of public goods or civic goods, looking at new ways of contracting, system level contracting for, say, a tree canopy of a city. How do you be able to do that? So yeah, it's pretty, I'll be open source it. So feel free, like you can read it all up. People are often that we document everything and share everything to make this part of a bigger move.
Just for the record there, you didn't tell us how you relaxed.
Gosh, I haven't relaxed for a while. I don't know. I feel like I've been on a bit of a roller coaster for the last few years. I don't know. I think it's pretty full on. Historically, my greatest pleasure was role playing. I used to do lots of role playing, and we used to play. There was a bunch of friends from my school, and we used to play Dungeons and Dragons, and that was really just great fun. I think I learned more doing that than I did learn at most schools, because I think it taught me how to see scenarios and positionalities in ways that was extraordinary. So that's probably history and then music, stuff like that. But yeah.
What is it, just switching wildly here, what is it that you're most excited about seeing coming down the line, Indy, in terms of, we've talked a lot about the challenges, we've talked a lot about how we need to change, but what are the things that are lighting you up at the minute? What are the things that are making you think, do you know what, that is a really interesting innovation, and I need to take a look at?
So what's lighting me up right now is that things that I thought were virtually impossible to say 6 months ago are materially possible. and the discourse and the kind of cognitive willingness to engage is now there. And I find that, and this is why I'm fundamentally an optimist, I think we can make this transition and we will make this transition. And I think, and I've just had an extraordinary CEO of a local authority in the UK, a city in the UK phoned me up, and I was like, and they found me on Twitter and they said, well, we've been following you for years and we like to chat. And it was just extraordinary, the work they'd done, the people they'd worked with and how they were thinking. So I'm actually deeply hopeful, and people are starting to recognize in a way there's no standing still here. It's time to just fall forward. And that's the only thing we can do is fall forward now. And that I think is fun. So in a sense, I operate in deep hope right now. Like underneath the big politics, the everyday stuff is moving.
We're going to come back and hear more from you at Futurebuild in the 100-year plan. But we always ask the guests on the podcast, what is your vision for the future? Now, you don't have to sneak peek in terms of the 100-year plan piece, but what do you desperately want to see from a future? I think you've outlined an awful lot of it today.
So I think there's two things. I think there are two fundamental components of a radical 100-year future. One is, I think, we will need to be a planetary civilization, and we will need to be we will start to talk about the planetary consciousnesses. We won't talk about 8 or 12 billion human beings. We will talk about 500 life forms. And as a part of a human, non-human, machine, institutional intelligence, the planet's consciousnesses will be our strategic asset. I think that's a kind of extraordinary breakthrough moment where we go from competitive theories of orchestration around territories to recognizing we're massively entangled with the planetary consciousnesses. And I think be able to see that. And that's not my vision. That's people like James Lovelock have actually charted that way forward in his Novacine book.
I was going to ask if you've been influenced by James Lovelock and
totally.
his Gaia hypothesis.
It's more than his Gaia hypothesis. I think Gaia's hypothesis slightly led people astray, in my view. I think that was because of the way, but a Novacine and the first third of Novacine really starts to lay some of this out in a really profound way. And I do think we are in that moment of, I think, a radical transformation in our theory of civilization. That has to be mirrored by, I think, a radical transformation in our theory of self. And like all great revolutions, they're a reimagination of who we are and the world is. These are symbiotic stories. So in the next 100 years, I would argue we're going to be radically reimagining ourselves as a multitude of organisms, as a spectrum of personalities, as a massively entangled with our biomes, and both in terms of in history and in the future. We will expand our theory of those relationships and our cognition to be able to deal with that. And I think that is a kind of extraordinary way for us to, I think this is a moment of extraordinary reimagination of what it means to be human. And just to concretize that, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man was a image of being human. And whether we want to talk about modular man, which is kind of the Cartesian theory of imagining man in a metric system, and the kind of robot, what I call mechanization of being human, I think we're in a new imagination of the human as an entangled agent, as a point of agency and entanglement. And I think that's an extraordinary vision. So perhaps a little bit too philosophical, but I think hopefully in the earlier parts of the podcast, I've shown their material manifestations, but at the 100-year cycle, I would say those two big things are going to be on the table. And in that reality, the future will be made in really radical terms. And I would say we should be an interplanetary species. We will be doing interplanetary mining. We will be doing extraordinary things like that, but we will also have to actually massively transform ourselves as who we are as a species and how we imagine our relationship to the planet, and recognizing we're fully indivisible from the ecological systems that we live with, as well as the machine systems that we live with as well, and the institutional logics around them. So this is the new type of planetary intelligence that's being born.
And that's the vision that we all need to get behind. You blow me away as usual, and thank you so much for making the time to come and speak to us today. And thanks again.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Oliver, I don't know how we're ever going to follow that up with another guest, really.
I'm very rarely left speechless, Martin. I've got a lot of ideas ticking around now. I think an unbelievable amount of things that Indy touched on just need to happen. The visionary way of valuing assets and looking at how we value the things that are around us and navigating this complex web of value in the construction industry in order to create a better future. I think, wow, there's so much in there, so much richness in that conversation. What I could say about the guys, he never disappoints. And we're so lucky to have him launching the 100-year plan with us at Futurebuild, alongside a stellar panel that we bring into everybody. We've got Pascal Schmidt, Secretary of State, Brussels. We've got Gemma Jerome from Building with Nature, and we've got Katrina Brady from the World Green Building Council, all giving us their take on the 100-year plan. What is our aspirational next level 100-year vision for how we need to shape everything that we're doing now, and how do we really achieve and accelerate towards that future? Because I'm not convinced that we've actually got a plan at the moment.
I know we're slightly biased. I would say it's probably one of the sessions to look out for on the Futurebuild conference. So, make sure you come along. It's on the Wednesday at about 4:15. So, and if you don't, we will be putting it on demand. And saying that, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please share, subscribe, and we will bring more inspirational people like Indy to you very soon.
Join our community to stay up to date with all things FutureX. Visit futurebuild.co.uk to sign up. Please also like them and share them to help grow our community. You can subscribe to the podcasts within your favourite podcast platform. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll be back again soon.